How do we meet our requirements of petroleum and oil products? 80% of India's oil comes from the Gulf countries, and 62% of its gas requirements comes from Qatar itself. Can India really push itself harder to exploit its own resources, or will India's growth be held hostage to the energy supplies from the Gulf countries? Over the past 1 week in the month of June, the price of crude oil has again touched $122 a barrel, and that is as high as it has gone 3 months ago, when there was again a sense of alarm that what do we do if the prices of oil continue to rise? Why are the prices of oil rising? There are multiple reasons for that. But most important is the fact that oil speculators add a fear premium to the price of oil based on the global scenario. The global scenario has been affected dramatically by 3 or 4 factors. One is the fact that for years Iran is not allowed to export oil, so that the requirement of the world has to be met by other countries, whether it's OPEC or African producers, or even countries like Russia, which was meeting the global requirement earlier. But now Russian oil exports have been sanctioned. And considering the fact that Russia has 10 to 25% of the oil reserves and gas reserves that are supplied globally, a much larger percentage of that is supplied to Europe per se. That is now a no-no, at least for some time, till the war in Ukraine goes on. So therefore, the world has to meet its demands by those who can supply without sanctions by America and its allies. That leaves the Gulf countries, who are, at least for India, the largest suppliers. But in addition to that, the OPEC, even though it has increased its production apparently by 650,000 barrels a day, it is not enough. What really needs to be done is a serious examination of what are our options to get the energy that we need to continue to fuel our growth. In the case of India, the finance minister apparently in last year's budget had projected that if oil prices hovered around $75 a barrel, India's budgetary estimates could be met as projected by the government of India last year. But this year down the line, in this financial year, the problems are even bigger. The figures of oil and their prices now touching almost $50 more than the projected $75 a barrel puts the government in a serious quandary. How do we meet our requirements of petroleum and oil products? For instance, 80% of India's oil comes from the Gulf countries, and 62% of its gas requirements comes from Qatar itself. Now, these countries have been in the news in India for other reasons too more recently. But the bigger challenge for the government of India is to look for alternative sources and to encourage Coal India, that supplies most of India's oil, to produce more coal. India apparently has the 5th largest coal reserves in the world, and 50% of India's requirement for generation of electricity is met by coal. But could India dig out more coal from its reserves? Some would say a more government invested and professionally approach address to the problem, which means going deeper down into coal mines than where we have gone already, would allow us to get more coal, or to ensure that we have an unhindered source of coal supplies from Indonesia and Australia that are huge coal suppliers. These coal and oil remain the primary sources of energy for growing economies like China and India, or even for countries in Europe which are dependent on Russian coal, oil and gas. In our case, the dependence on Russia is minimal. But if you look at the figures of what we need or what we get from natural resources, or as people would say, fossil fuels, then our requirements are met as follows. We get 45% of our energy requirements, or maybe even 50%, from coal. Oil gives us 23%, gas gives us 10%, maybe 12%. So this between the two makes it another 35%. And then there is biomass, which is a whole lot of wood, cow dung and all the other items that make up for our renewables, and these go into another 20%. Left we are with hydro power or solar reserves, or through wind, or even nuclear reserves. Interesting, though there is a strong lobby for having more nuclear reactors in India, nuclear reserves per se provide only 1.5% of India's energy requirements, and the figure in coming years with more reactors could go up to 4.5%. The other sources, that is wind energy and gas, solar and gas products through renewables, could be enhanced further. But the primary dependence will remain on coal, which we get from India's soil, but even we get from countries in Southeast Asia and Australia, and oil and gas, which the dependence on the Middle East will have to continue. Interestingly, even though we produce a lot of coal for our own requirements, it is not enough to meet the requirement of the households of India, because by some accounts, more than 250 million people still don't have a continuous supply to electricity that comes from coal. So what are our choices? India needs to increase hydropower, that is dams and production of energy and electricity through water sources of rivers. We haven't exploited our dams and rivers and that of our neighbors adequately, such as Nepal. Bhutan, yes, provides a fair amount of electricity through its rivers to West Bengal, but India could do a lot better. The second area is that nuclear reactors need to be stepped up. Unfortunately, whenever nuclear reactors, the argument tries to take shape, there are lobbies that work against them, and equally important is the fact that with the exception of countries like Russia, which give a certain amount of insurance cover to their nuclear reactor providing outfits and companies, other American companies do not get the insurance cover that they need to have to provide nuclear energy to India and cover them and the people from a disaster of the sort that we saw in the case of Bhopal or Europe saw in the case of Chernobyl. And the third aspect is that we need to do much more better usage of solar and wind energy. But even then, if these aspects are taken care of, where does it leave us? There is no getting away from the fact that fossil fuels, that is essentially oil and gas that comes from the earth's soil, will continue to be 75 to 85% of our requirement in the coming years. Currently, some would argue it's up to 95%. But the world is gone beyond the peak production of oil and gas, which has taken 150 million years to be manufactured in the earth's soil. The world's ruthless exploitation of these resources has already led to a fact where we are past the peak, which means we are on a downward curve, which means that half the world's known reserves have been exhausted. And we have another 60, maybe 80 years to find ways to get on with life without oil and gas related energy. What also is important to understand that India is dependent on oil and gas will largely be on Gulf countries. The reason is that they are near us, the supply routes are sorted out, and they are a great source of energy to us in the years now and in the years ahead. In addition to that, we need to understand that the countries that are largely the oil and gas producers, they are interestingly, almost all of them are autocrats. America has a think tank called Freedom House, and Freedom House monitors the state of democracy in the world. And in the case of the state of democracy in the world, out of the 13 countries which are the major oil and gas producers, apparently 11 have been declared by them to be autocracies or autocrats, ruled by dictators or are police states, and 2 are meant to be not so free. Therefore, even America has to pull itself up from not lecturing the oil producers too much about the state of their internal governance or their freedom and human rights status. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, it has no choice but to engage with them. And this remains a reason why Mr. Putin has chosen to go ahead with his invasion of Ukraine and not bother too much about what the world thinks of him. Because apparently, over the last 2 decades, he has earned more than $4 trillion worth of foreign exchange just purely by exporting oil and gas. So the clout that Russia has will remain, but also the clout the Arab countries can exercise on India, and India's foreign policy choices are huge. We've seen most recently that the countries in the Gulf did pass certain comments on India to control the anti-Islamic sentiments of certain jingoistic lobbies, and many in India argued that this was an interference on the internal matters of India, but it gives them the freedom to do that, and it restricts India's ability to respond to them because of the leverage of oil and gas, which in turn remains the key aspect of our foreign policy and diplomacy, and energy security therefore has many countries like India left with very few choices if we are going to continue on our growth path. It was projected in 2010 that India and China would be having about half of the total GDP worth of economic clout as the G7 countries. By 2060, that is 2060, the total GDP of India and China is expected to be in excess of the OECD countries. And that can only be achieved if India and China are able to ensure their energy reserves are continuing to be supplied. They keep strategic reserves within their country. India has got apparently strategic reserves for about 2 weeks of crisis situations, but 2 weeks is not good enough. It would need at least 2 months, if not 3 months, in the event of volatility in prices that could hold us further hostage to the geo-economic situation. Because the current geo-economic situation has already taken a hit and given a hit to the Indian foreign exchange reserves. We had in January something to the tune of $631 billion worth of foreign exchange reserves. And with these rising prices, our foreign exchange reserves are already down to $600 billion. Is it going to go down further? Can we bounce back with other alternatives to decreasing our energy consumption and increasing our trade? The answers seem few and far between. The final point to understand is that if India wishes to be a global player, it not only has to explore other alternatives for energy which will allow India to be less dependent on Gulf suppliers, and those alternatives will have to come from India's east, that is Southeast Asia and Russia, not so much from the Gulf countries, but also from India's own reserves which are there but haven't been sufficiently exploited. The big question is that can India really push itself harder to exploit its own resources, or will India's growth be held hostage to the energy supplies from the Gulf countries, and to that extent will they have a say on India's internal dynamics even in future?